The ACN podcast is made possible thanks to the generosity of our listeners and sponsors, including the Agile Alliance. As a nonprofit membership organization, the Agile Alliance is an excellent resource to help you along your Agile journey. To learn more about the Agile Alliance and our other sponsors, as well as how you can become a sponsor or supporter of our show, please visit acnpodcast.org for more information. And thank you for your support. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Agile Coaching Network. My name's Ray Arell. What we do at this call is we have this virtual park bench, which basically spans across the globe. We get people here to give a whole group of different opinions associated to things that are going on in your Agile adoption. The goal here is, as always, we basically, open up a topic. I'm the facilitator, but also a participant. What we do is in this virtual park bench is we all offer just a little bit of advice to how to work on a particular problem, or also just give some great examples of some ways that Agile has worked well for our companies that we work for. With that, let's go ahead and get started with the first question. How do we overcome the negative bias from a previously failed Agile adoption and a new transformation initiative? What messaging to break apart from the past? And I think the question was originally done by Brian. I know Brian's not here, so if we want to go ahead and kick that discussion off. Anyone want to dive in first? Okay, I guess I'll dive in first. So there's a couple different things to look at when we're trying to overcome a failed attempt. And I know that there's different extremes of failure. I've had Agile adoptions that I've walked into where they weren't adopting Agile, and that non-adoption of what we would consider the Agile mindset, combined with some rigid rules associated to how Scrum was implemented or some other methodology. Self-organization can never occur, and there was apparently just, the Scrum master was beating people over the head, as a common pattern that we see. And what I see in this particular thing to rehabilitate people in this case is, one, when you're saying messaging and breaking from the past, I think it's really you need to sit down with the team and understand the past. I don't think as a new Agile coach coming in can I suddenly say that, I understand exactly what all the problems were. So having a retrospective to start with is probably a good idea, and a really good facilitated retrospective at that. What are other people's ideas?
I completely agree with the retrospective. I'd say not just probably a good idea, that you're crazy if you don't do that after a failed attempt. Otherwise, you're just going to retrace some of those same steps.
Absolutely agree. And there's even more in the retrospective. There might even be some gems hidden in the failed attempt that already work or are already a positive experience. So make sure to recover those as well. And the other thing is, be pretty sure about the why of your transformation. So what are leaders or whoever initiates it trying to achieve? And are you working in that direction, or does the team concur with the intention? Because otherwise you'll fail again anyway.
Yeah, I've seen that where people have not actually specified why are we doing the Agile in the first place, and part of the failure analysis comes down to no one knew what the goal was. Jeremy?
I would echo that. I think what Jörg said is right on. I think once you get outside of your team, and especially to the customers, no one cares how you work. They just care about, are you creating a product and a service that makes me awesome? Mm-hmm. So, if you can keep that in mind, like, what are we trying to achieve by enhancing our agility? And then what are our impediments? You can start chipping away at those, and then you'll get to a recipe that we're familiar with, or maybe you'll invent your own, but you're always doing it with that goal in mind.
Right. Sven?
I think maybe you have to step or go one step back before. I can imagine that people who just experienced a failed transformation are not really open for this discussion in a retrospective. So maybe you just need to create some environment, some honest environment, some open environment, so that the colleagues can open themselves and express their experience with the previous try. Yeah.
Right. So one thing that also I think, what if the individual who tried to lead the Agile adoption prior is now a part of this group? So you're the new coach coming in, the individual who was adopting it wrong or was leading the adoption wrong is in the room. How do you deal with that? You just don't point at the individual.
Not sure if the person who was leading the adoption is the one to blame that it failed. So at least not necessarily.
Right. So
I would look at any failed adoption as probably some mix of cultural, psychological, and technical kind of issues. And you've got to dig in to figure out how much of what is present in this and why did that previous attempt go sideways. So the person who's leading it might have looked at only one or two of those dimensions, or maybe, if you walk into a situation where the culture is great and they just had a poor technical implementation, that seems like an easier thing to fix than if you've got people who are deeply psychologically wounded or psychologically opposed to Agile in the first place, or the culture just won't allow it to persist.
Yeah, very true. Yeah.
I'm curious what people think about language. In that I've noticed that some organizations where they've had a failed experiment, rather than continuing to experiment, those terms associated with the failed experiment become sort of verboten. Like you can't say Agile or Scrum, or people just immediately tune out. Right. And so I know when I looked at like IBM's process, and I went, well, that's just like Scrum, but they have hills instead of stories, or whatever their terms are. But I've seen in other contexts as well is sometimes just changing the language or not using those terms associated with that negativity can open people up again, even if some of the practices are similar. I'm curious if anyone's had any experience experimenting with the language you use to describe the process.
Yeah,
which makes sense, because then you immediately also focus more on the why and instead of what. Yeah. So why do we do this, and what are the Agile principles? Yeah. When you don't call them Agile principles, you just ask the team, and they usually figure out themselves.
Yeah, and I think from the changing the methodology, it depends on the damage, I guess, though. I mean, in certain cases, I've heard people say that they've been scrummed, or Agile, and we only did little a Agile and all the other different terms that might come out with that. The extreme damage, the way that I've rehabilitated teams from that side is that I would start them off with some simple patterns that we would use in, let's say, from a Scrum perspective. We would say, hey, let's go ahead and use a Kanban board, and let that Kanban board get them used to using that, and then suddenly eject, hey, why don't we also have this retrospective process now that we've released a couple of different things, and hey, wouldn't a daily stand-up be good? And slowly work them into the patterns to the point where they're doing the method, but they're doing it in a way that they're leading it, that they're making the choices to implement or not to implement. So as a coach, I would say, here's some recommendations, but I would never go in and say, thou must, do these things.
I think the choice of language is one of the most important there is. And anybody who's interested in this beyond just like the discussion today, go read George Lakoff's book, Lakoff, Metaphors We Live By. The choices in Scrum, the use of Scrum as a metaphor, and the use of vertical slices of an application. These are very abstract ideas, this software, this application, this solution that we're slicing into vertical things. Well, we're not really slicing a physical object. There's all sorts of metaphor at work here. And I agree with the original question that led us here, that sometimes these metaphors get damaged by failure, but it's usually possible to reframe the problem in different metaphors that people can get behind. And people do that naturally.
So also in this space, though, when we say the failure itself, and particularly the initiative, and I think we said this in the very beginning, which is, one, how do you sense out the negative bias that's there? Is it Was it within the team? What was it environmental that was around the team that inhibited them to be able to go off and do the work effectively in an agile way? Meaning, and this is a common pattern I still see in big business today, which is, okay, you guys can work in Scrum, but here's the product requirements document, and it's 100%. It needs to be delivered at 100%. And so these negative outside patterns, which some teams feel that they can't address, so they feel that they can only work so agile, or maybe to the point where there's a lot of meddling that's going on from the outside organizations that cause them to not be able to embrace that fully. And I think that's a bigger challenge if you suddenly find that it wasn't the group of 12 that was the problem, it was actually, the outside organization. How have people addressed outside of the team issues?
I would question, is that a complete failure? Or, there's always going to be external circumstances that you may not be able to control. So based on the things that you can control, how much of that can you improve?
Okay.
And until the whole world is agile, there's always going to be that boundary. The only question is, how far from you is it? If you're the only agile team in an organization, it's right in front of you. But at some point, a lot of organizations have that boundary between, say, development teams and human resources or finance. And if nothing else, even if you're an agile enterprise, you're going to have a boundary between your agile work and some of your customers. So the question might be, how far away is that boundary? And that's how much it would interfere with you.
That's true. But, I think that's a challenge with whatever methodology that you go off and implement within your team. I think.
Of course it is. The old company we worked at, I remember when the CMM was being adopted, there were internal standards that people had to go off and fill out forms and templates for. But then there was a CMM adoption that was going on at the same time. And these poor folks on the boundary ended up having to do both. It was crazy. But it was completely understandable because the people on one side said, no, this is the way we live and work. People on the other side said, no, this is the way we live and work. And the poor folks in the middle were really stuck.
Yeah. And well, let me ask that other question about failure and the framing of failure, because it's interesting that word is being used in this context. Should we as an Agile coach immediately just say that, look, framing it as failure versus framing it as learning? Do you think that we should not use the fail word?
Well, I don't know. I was thinking back to something that David Hussman said, and then that whether it's an experiment or a failure depends on how much of your resources you used up. If you had $500,000 and you spend $250,000 of it, that's a failure. If you spend $50,000 of it, that was an experiment. So smaller bets. Right. So the smaller your bet, the less that's more of an experiment. Another way I look at it is like, well, if you gave up, that's when it's a failure. If you keep experimenting or keep evolving, then you have an ongoing experiment.
That's a good point. But if you look at from a standard a standard Scrum cost about in US dollars about $40,000 for a 2-week increment of work. Is $40,000 for some companies considered a failure if they burn through $40,000? Or is that when you say from a sizing of experiment perspective, if I've got $80,000 and I just wasted half of it, one, I probably am underfunded. But, what would be the boundary condition still, though, that if you look at the people we're trying to rehabilitate, would we as coaches ever use the word failure?
I'd like to see the industry move away from the word experiment in this, because I acknowledge that what Hussman says is there's a good nugget there about the size of the bet and whether or not the bet succeeds or fails. But it reminds me of Bob Glass's book, Facts and Fallacies of Software Engineering. And he talks about research versus advocacy. And that taught me when I read that book many, many years ago that I am not a researcher in industry. I am an advocate. Because I'm not doing anything like design of experiments. And I'm not using the scientific method with falsifiable hypotheses. So the experiment word that we're borrowing from the world of science doesn't really apply in most of the situations where we use it. It's possible to design experiments and have randomly assigned Scrum teams to various methods and all of that, but no one does that. They try something and it either works or they feel it doesn't, call it a failure or not. But it doesn't really seem like an experiment. And frankly, experiments don't fail. It's either the null hypothesis or the alternative hypothesis is true.
Well, let me poke on that for a little bit. Do you think, though, one of the when someone says, "Is Agile more effective than another method?" and if you go look across our industry of this sort of debate, this one feels better than this one feels better. Do you think part of the issue is that us as Agile coaches, we're not also being researchers at the same time, so that when we go to an Agile conference, we're not just saying, "Hey, it feels good if you do this."
Well, all right. So there's a huge discussion here about things like publication bias. You get rejected from conferences if you bring in failure stories. You get accepted if you bring in raging success. Same is true in publication. You don't see the raging failure published because that's not sexy. And this is true across the board. It's true in science as well. And we're seeing a lot of debate about that within things like healthcare research and irreproducibility of results. So there's that whole area lurking there. But you don't find people doing any kind of rigorous experimentation within Agile methods. They're trying stuff within as best control as they can. But if you're building software, you can't randomly assign engineers to one of two teams, and one does a certain methodology, the other does a second methodology, and you try to build the same system twice. And even then, you have n equal 2. So there's not much to say about that. We really are advocates for what we believe works based on some feedback from the environment. And that's way different to me than an experiment.
We could run that experiment. We just need much larger budgets.
Exactly. And there are places where people try those things, but then we, in industry, we tend to roll our eyes at these things where graduate students try this, and you say, that's not real. But then they're play projects or something in grad school.
But then don't you think it's unfair that in the same voice, and I know we might be getting slightly off topic here, but then suddenly we have people within the management circle coming in and saying, please show me the data that says the experiment worked? Versus,
well, I'd say stop calling it an experiment, and then I would say we did this and this happened. Now, is that a causal relationship? Was it completely accidental? It's n equal 1. We tried it and it worked once with this team on that project. Should we do it again? Sure, if you want to, but don't call that an experimental data or an experimental result.
Dan, do you have something out of this? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I agree. These are kind of complex human systems, and they're very sensitive to their initial conditions, and the chance that you could reproduce this in the exact same way with another team in a different context is going to be questionable, I think. So yeah, I'm in full agreement with Eric, basically saying that calling these experiments is fine, but it's not really an experiment. It's kind of a misappropriated term from the world of science, and it's really it's a bet. It's a bet. You could call them probes.
Yeah, I think probe is a better term for it, or trial.
Trial, sure. Pilot, successful pilot, fine too.
Yeah. We're advocates, we're not researchers, so we shouldn't use that framing for these things, because back to Lakoff's work, if we borrow that metaphor, we bring along a lot of certainty, power, and the whole weight of scientific reason that isn't really valid. And I think we get into trouble when we assert things that this is the result of an experiment. Well, no, it's not. And the problem is management hears it as though it were, and then we get in big trouble.
Getting back to the question on adoption, worked with a coach once, and he, in framing the work that we were going to do in adopting Agile practices, he framed it as an experiment that we were going to try. And I think what helped in that sense was the sense of a light commitment, that if this worked, we'd do more of it. And if it didn't work, then we could either do something else or go back to our old way of working, whatever else. But this wasn't like, even I think a pilot has this connotation of we're going to try it, but then we're going to keep going. And I think having that sense of a light commitment helped people who were a little reluctant feel willing to try it out. So maybe there's a better terminology, but I found that with that team, that framing was helpful.
And I've actually done the same thing, and I've especially when rehabilitating a team, the only thing that I have to insert into that is that what I tell those teams is yes, we're going to experiment with Scrum, but we're still going to be Agile, meaning we're not dropping away from using the mindset. This is how we're going to behave as an organization moving forward. What methods we choose in order to fulfill that is up for us to experiment, and I'll throw that word in there, and to see what works for us. But we're not I never want to get into a debate where, we're not going to be Agile. We're going to experiment with Agile and then leave Agile. I don't want to get into that space. It's no, we are going to be Agile, but the methods are optional. Which ones we choose. So do we want to stay on this topic, or do we want to continue forward? We're having a good discussion. Well, if there's a silence there, then I'm going to go move to another question. The question, actually, I'm going to go pick from the middle of the list. I'm going to kind of move it around a little bit. This is a question from a person called Grace. She said, what are some of the tips to making Agile succeed on a geographically dispersed team? So I assume that this is, I've got, people all over the place and I'm trying to assemble an Agile team. How do I make that work effectively? What are some of the good methods that you guys have used?
I'd start with foundations of good architecture and say it's got to do with loose coupling and high cohesion between the locations. The more tangling there is across the distance, the worse it's going to be.
I agree. And I think, if taking what portions of your architecture that can be done with as many people in one site is probably the best approach that you can do. The other thing is, especially when you're dealing with geographically dispersed and something that we realized a long time ago, because I was a part of the first expansion of my prior company I was with to India. We made the mistake of thinking, okay, we're going to be growing into this, other side of the planet, and it's going to make us be able to develop 24/7. We're going to be able to develop, around the clock. And reality was, it didn't happen. The conversations were strained because we had to, have conversations in the middle of the night or the middle of the morning, meaning, really early or really late in order to sync the teams. And we finally came to the conclusion that if we're going to geographically disperse, do it within a couple time zone hops. Don't try to go across, 5 time zones. It's just too much.
Yeah, if you look at the worst possible Scrum team, you'd have the Scrum master in one location, you'd have the product owner in another location, and you'd have each of the 6 developers in a different time zone as well. And you say that is the world's worst Scrum team. So you've got to do the opposite of that to the greatest extent possible.
I guess the other question in that space would be, if you can't undo it, meaning let's say that it's just the way it is. Let's say we do have a team in California and a team over in India. What's our best approach? What would be the way that you guys would attack that problem?
So in my previous company, what we did was we co-located the whole team on one side for a couple of weeks, so they get used to each other. They work with each other as a co-located team, and then of course they had to get back to their own location. But the connection between the people was established, and then over the time you notice that the connections get loose or looser a little bit, and so you have to establish regular meetings, face-to-face meetings with the team member, so that you keep the connection and the network within the team. So that's what works with my team quite well.
Those are all good things. I mean, I've done those before as well. I think the other thing is let's say if you are, I don't mean to make this Scrum specific, but if you have a product owner, you want to have daily interactions with that individual, that putting together a proxy product owner that's sitting in the remote site or that way that those people need to communicate so that they're in sync. 2 product owners kind of sharing the same responsibility works well, because then the developer can go up and talk to that product owner on a daily basis versus, having to wait 24 hours to get a message back. Technology-wise, I think we can all agree, and I'm willing to hear someone else's opinion on this, but you do need some tools. And I know that speaking about tools and Agile coaching are sometimes things that we don't want to do, but you do need to have some way of having a common backlog that people can see. And so you have to implement some form of technology. It doesn't have to be that complicated. I've seen teams use a shared Google Doc. I've seen people use, some other video camera that points at their Kanban board, and people can go look at it at any time as long as they keep the lights on that side. I've also seen really advanced teams that actually use telepresence robots and other things to give that human interaction as well. It just depends on if you're taking the plunge of having a geographically dispersed team, you need to make the investments in order to bring the teams together closer. And I think, Sven, what you said there about bringing them together for a face-to-face at least, once in the product, as you're starting to get it going is a key thing. Jeremy?
I work with a number of remote teams where some members are remote are together, some aren't. And I was asking around when I started working with them for advice from other people. And what I kept hearing was, if some people are remote, act as if everyone is remote, which hurts my heart a little bit, because you do lose some of that benefit of being face-to-face, but it definitely helps the remote people feel more included. So we did this a lot with the retrospectives, using either virtual whiteboards or some of the other online tools. And everyone, even if 4 people were in the same room and 2 people were in remote locations, everyone was using their own laptop and on the conference call, and that's how we ran those sessions. So everyone used the online tools. It wasn't just a few people. Now, we did it with another team I worked with. We only had one engineer who was remote, and he had been initially co-located and then moved. So he already had a very good relationship with the team. And we had people who would occasionally work from home. So for things like retros, we did the exercise physically in the room, and each remote person had an advocate in the room. So that person would write their feedback on the stickies, post them on the wall, and sort of act as their hands within the room if they wanted to get a word in edgewise, and somehow the conversation wasn't allowing it, they would message that person, who would then sort of step in for them. So having each person paired with an advocate also helped.
Right. I've heard that called Sticky Buddy as well, which is an interesting name.
Ew.
Yeah, that is definitely an ew. How about others? What are other ways that people have coped with the distance thing? If there's no more, I'm willing to go pivot to the next question. That was an easy one to get out. And I'm going to actually step one up. And Sven, since you're here, you've got a question up here that if you want to go ahead, can you get to the Slido, or do you want me to read it for you?
This one. Okay. Because I have a few. Yes, so we have currently a situation where we start to establish Scrum, and it shows that we definitely need someone who is apart from me, who's dealing with all the processes, the education of the team, and basically all the things a Scrum Master has to do. But I don't see the product or the company is not yet acknowledging the benefit of a Scrum Master. So we have only the chance to pick someone from a developer who's doing it and who wants to do it and wants to get deeper into the topic.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Well, I think the challenge is, especially if you have, your company isn't willing to invest in, and I'm going to take it outside of the word Scrum Master and put the word Agile Coach in. I believe that you can learn some things off the street, but then the team is learning together, meaning that this individual who's playing Scrum Master really doesn't have the experience or the capability of taking the team to a higher level, because they're at the same level as the rest of the team members. So investment in whoever the part-timer is still is a big benefit to that business, meaning send them to some training. And I know training doesn't respond to everything. Find places where this individual can work and interact with sort of if I think of the guilds model, who are the masters that are out in the environment outside of the company that they can network in with. And so part of that part-time responsibility needs to be you need to go learn up how to be the best Scrum Master that you are, because theoretically they're going to get measured for it. And the team's going to have to, really respect the individual as they come in and give advice, But but by the way, what you call out as a pattern here is the same problem I see happening with leads and managers as well. Meaning, a lot of companies, for whatever reason, take the smartest person in the technical team and say, "Ooh, that person needs to be the lead because they're the smartest person there," or they need to be the manager of the team. Same pattern, be the Scrum Master because you're the smartest developer here. You tend to be the one who's always focused on process. But I can tell you that in all cases that I've seen across the industry, those people struggle because they were never trained as managers. They were never trained as leads, and they were never trained as Scrum Masters. And that makes it very difficult for them to be able to succeed. How about others? What do you guys think?
Yeah, unfortunately, the most experienced developer is the one who's keen on doing it.
Yes, and sometimes they don't know their own strength, I guess.
Yeah, and I know as well it's not about the technical experience you have. It's about the soft skill experience and how to deal with the people, and not with the technical issues.
Right. Dan, did you have something to add to this?
Yeah, I was just going to say it's not ideal, but the team could also step up and fulfill some responsibilities that the Scrum Master has, right? So a couple of trivial examples would be things like, every team member should be able to update their own Jira or their tool status, right, on a daily basis, as opposed to perhaps relying on the Scrum Master to do it, do some tool updates. Another is, not ideal, but does the Scrum Master have to resolve the impediments of the team, or can the team actually take some ownership of some of those impediments? And obviously a downside of that is they're spending time on impediment removal and not spending time, writing software. So not ideal, but some options.
Yeah, well, but this I would really like to put in the hands of the Scrum Master.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Because it releases the others from...
Yeah. But if that's not an option, then what? Yeah. Right? Is the question.
Yeah, sure.
I'd also ask, what about the long term? I'm reminded of a certain keynote this person named Ray gave about Scrum must die. And I'm also reminded of my own experience as a change agent over the years, where sometimes the change agent's presence in a team becomes the biggest impediment to change, because the group starts to look to that person as paying that debt. Oh, we have this person, so we don't have to worry about that. So rather than taking the new behaviors, the new organization definition on themselves, they sort of give it to the change agent and say, there, we're done. The box is checked. So the person has to extricate themselves and leave before they realize, oh, I guess we have to do this. So in this argument, I would just think about exactly what you want in the long term from a Scrum Master. And should we be looking again at Scrum as a transition to something more fluidly agile? And we don't want to perpetuate practices that should be transitionary just because we have a role defined and that person needs something to do.
Yeah, and I would add in that particular space, as a Scrum Master, and I've been a Scrum Master on teams, I would never update people's Jira. I'm not their admin. I'm helping them to do Scrum well. Versus, becoming just the individual who's doing updates and impediment removal, yes, is important, but there's a lot of things that should be the team's responsibility, Yeah,
isn't it Musk who says any product that needs a manual is broken? So you could sort of extend that and say any team that needs a Scrum Master is yet to achieve what they're really after.
Yes. Jeremy, what do you have?
So I'd like to break that question into two parts. One is this condition, a company not willing to willing to afford a Scrum Master, and this implied solution of someone else should do it. And instead of talking about who should do it, let's go back to that first part. You have a company that cannot or is not yet willing to afford a full-time Scrum Master. And I would start to look at what are the causes of that situation. And I would say that if I were in that situation, part of it it'd be my responsibility to take ownership of that and say, I did not do a good job of of selling the value or connecting the value that a Scrum Master would provide to what is important to the person holding those purse strings.
Mm-hmm.
What do they need, and how can I tie the value of this position to what they need? And if I'm not communicating that well, that's my fault. I need to keep trying. Or maybe I don't understand their needs well enough to be able to successfully advocate.
Right. I agree with that.
Give me a couple of good arguments.
The arguments are that if you look at the transition time,
it's hard to measure. So
well, there's a couple things. There's the risk. There's several different risks that happen in Agile adoptions, and that is one. If every team is going to go move slower as they're learning up new methodologies, and meaning the team is going to become less productive as the new methodology is being brought into the system. And what a good, well-trained Agile coach can do is shorten that period of time that it takes the team to get back to proficiency, as well as accelerate the delivery performance of the team. So if you look at, the first thing that I typically do when I go in and look at these teams is this inconsistent, planning issue, which, their velocity is all over the bloody place, and there's no predictability of the team about what they can deliver in a 2-week period of time. If you're not skilled at that and understanding and spotting that pattern of that, you might not work on, that first, which, then you start building sandcastles, basically, which is, the tide comes in and, wipes out all your performance because you're not focused on those first low-level things that have to take place before the next thing occurs. And so the thing that you could tell management is look, if I have an Agile coach that gets me through this startup period of time, that startup time is going to be shorter. And significantly shorter because they know what they're doing. They know how to go apply these things. The other thing that is common in looking at this kind of instability, and particularly why Agile Scrum Masters and coaches that you pick need to be senior individuals within the organization, is the global impediments that are around the team that need to be worked on. Meaning, that particular issue requires somebody to go have a conversation with the general manager or with the vice president or with someone else in the organization, the sales managers or whomever. You need to have somebody who has the respect to the organization a bit to be able to go off and change some of the systems that are outside. And if you take your, and I've seen this pattern happen, a lot, where they take the most junior person and they make them the Scrum Master. That person isn't tooled to go have a conversation with the general manager. So impediments don't get fixed outside of the team. Or they have no influence with the senior developers that are on the team as well. So they end up failing that job because they can't assert the influence that they need in order to basically get people to, take their leadership and to help them to move forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but to get make sense for Agile coach, I certainly agree. But my question is how to convince to get an additional person into the team. Yeah. So and the first question is how much more do I earn with this more people with this person in addition to the rest? Yeah. So first, it's in the beginning definitely it's one more cost.
Well, it goes down to team velocity. So if a team has an unstable velocity now, meaning that they're all over the place and there is no way of understanding whether or not things are going to come in or be delivered or not be delivered, a good Agile coach working on that problem, looking at prioritizing what's going to have the largest bang for the dollar and be focused just on that problem, that's going to mean that the transformation is going to happen quicker. The team is going to be more productive faster than they would if they were just trying it by themselves. And so that's part of the framing that I would do. Now, getting it down to an exact dollar, that becomes a little bit more of a challenge because all teams that we've done adoptions with, I know have been different, meaning that on average, how long does it take a team to get from, the starting point of Scrum to the actual, stable, for me has been about 5 sprints. It's 5 2-week sprints. That's when the team finally emerges out the other end and starting to gain some productivity and some stability within their planning process. After that, then it becomes now working on ways of even increasing their performance further, and that depends on what you're adopting. Meaning that if we suddenly said we're going to go do test-driven development as an organization, and we have no tests written, guess what? We're going to probably be spending months trying to go do that. And that's going to vary depending on how old the code base is and a whole bunch of other things associated to that. But again, why do you have a manager? That's to lead individuals to help them grow. We as managers have acknowledged that we should, per 19 people, I think is the industry number now, there should be one person leading 19 people. And you have to ask the same question, is it okay to have a Scrum Master that's currently working, across 20 people or 50 people or, 150 people? And that says that you're not going to be committed to getting this stuff done effectively. It's going to be slower. Does anyone else have something to add to this?
Only that there's a mildly related problem that I've seen where a lot of teams and even whole organizations fail because they can never figure out how to work at different time scales at the same time. They either get too short-term oriented where, no, we can't invest in a Scrum Master because there's a short-term cost to that we can't bear, mortgaging the long-term success of the organization. Or they get so distracted on improvements and things that they get eaten from the rear. So there's got to be some sort of an argument for this Agile coach or Scrum Master in terms of both those things, that it has short-term benefits that are balanced with the long-term good of the organization.
No, I fully agree with that. But again, I think that's where the meaningful conversation, I think back to Jeremy's point, was, framing this about we've already chosen Scrum, so we already know some of the benefits of why we're trying to go do it. The question is, are we going to make the investment where it can be successful? The worst thing you can do is establish a vision like, let's be agile, and by the way, no, you don't get any help, So we've got about 10 minutes left. Do we want to, I think there's a related question that I see up here, which is, as a developer, I'm not a developer, but I've been given a role as a Scrum Master. How do I build credibility with my team? So this is the classic, well, you're not the technical person. How can you give me guidance? Does anyone have?
I think for me, I think this comes down to an attitude of service, which I think a lot of people step into a new role and they feel they have to prove themselves. And one way they think they do that is by taking command and making things happen. And it seems like that's just a great way to alienate people. Whereas if you come in and you have that attitude of, how can I help you? I am at your disposal. My job is to make your life easier. You earn a lot more political capital and a lot more trust faster.
So you get into more of the servant leadership model and make sure that you're available to the team to help them where you can. Now, what do you do with the fact that and I saw this with one team one time, because I am a developer, that's my background, but the Scrum Master was being duped by the development team. They were giving them, bad data, and they were purposely doing it. Ethically, it wasn't good. Do you think that a developer can effectively be a Scrum Master? I mean, a non-developer? Dan?
I think so, and I think as a non-developer, you need to be careful about what advice you're giving, and especially if it's outside your domain of experience and knowledge. So, for example, a Scrum Master should be able to give advice about Scrum and Scrum processes, right? Scrum roles.
Right.
Might not be willing to give you advice on refactoring or something more technical, right? Refactoring practices, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that. I mean, I've come into a lot of teams, and I'm a UX guy, so I don't write code, or haven't in a very, very long time. And I often come in with the most Agile and Scrum experience, so I'm helping sort of in an unofficial coaching Scrum Master-ish like role, help that team get better. So there are a lot of things that I can help with, how we run stand-ups, how we run retros, and I can introduce them to practices like pairing or mobbing or other things that I think might be helpful. And there I can say, here's why I think they're helpful. Here, let me communicate some of the underlying principles behind them. But then as developers, they need to choose to adopt them and possibly do some additional research on their own to really see how they're going to fit in with their current practices. Because I'm not a developer, so I can't speak to that.
Right. I think also, then I'll take the servant leadership one step forward and talk about synergistic leadership qualities. And that is what I would expect to be able to do as a synergistic leader is I might not have the core knowledge myself, but I know who to bring in. And being able to connect the dots for the team when they say, hey, we would like to learn this up. Well, it's like, I don't know how to teach that, but you know what? I know some people that do. You want mob programming? Hey, I'll go get Woody Zoll, and I'll go pull in other individuals that I know that can actually do that for the team. So maybe part of what this individual needs to build credibility is they need to build a better network of individuals that they can work with.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, the word credibility itself, and specifically if I look at the old kind of fight between developers and testers, there was always that kind of, well, you're not and I use developer in the old terms versus the new terms, developers are testers as well. But I know that older norms of sort of the kind of the entrenched attitudes that might exist in certain teams, especially if they're very old development teams. I think the challenge comes there is that you're going to win some credibility in certain camps, but you might not gain credibility across the entire team. And you have to be comfortable with that. There's a lot of times that some individuals will be attracted to what you're saying and others just won't. You help who you can. Any other on this one? Sven?
So I think a non-developer can definitely be a Scrum Master, but as you said, so he has to bring, in best case, bring a good network, or at least try to get into this development domain. So don't get told any stuff by the developers, which he just can accept because he doesn't know any better. And so that's the only problem of what I see. But I don't think that there's a big issue on that. So I think maybe even someone from outside has even more ability to point or to ask, as we say, stupid questions. So which no one from a developer would ask because they have their let's say predefined thinking, or their bias in certain things, and a non-developer has some out of the box view on certain topics, which can even more helpful.
Sure. Jeremy, do you want to have the last word on this one?
Well, so what I'm really curious about is this notion that developers are feeding false information. And it just makes me wonder, what about the environment in which they operate has made them believe that it is in their best interests to lie about their own situation? And understanding that context, and maybe that's the first thing that needs to be dealt with.
Oh, absolutely. And I put that in there as far as a scenario that I had saw to let you know how that got resolved. Was this team was at least good enough to say, could you bring another Agile coach in to come in and observe our Agile adoption? And that individual basically figured out that is what was going on. The remedy from that was reestablishing working agreements for the team to, one, just sort of set some boundary conditions about, again, what was the responsibility of the developer, what was the responsibility of the Agile coach or the Scrum Master in this case. And there was a poor set of role definitions that were in this team of what exactly was the responsibility of each, and that whole notion of why the lying was occurring turned out to be just a very small subset of individuals who were not bought into the process at all. They wanted to work in their old way, and it finally came out through this retrospective process that the outside coach was able to do as an outsider looking in. And then it eventually needed to be kind of reset, sort of a reset button on, okay, well, that's, not acceptable behavior across the team. And the team agreed that that's not acceptable, to be able to do that. And
so
go ahead.
It sounds like they were trying to sabotage the adoption. Is that correct?
Yeah, it pretty much came down to it was a sabotage attempt by a few individuals in the team. Have sort of, okay, you want me to come and do this daily stand-up, I'm just going to come up here and just, feed you, whatever, I'm not going to give you true data, which was very unfortunate. But again, from a Scrum Master, not being a developer, couldn't see through some of that. So
this kind of problem in cultures is hardly unique to Agile, though. I remember the days when teams always padded their estimates because they knew management was going to cut them. And management always cut the estimates because they knew the developers were padding them, and it was this crazy game. So the games like this continue to happen, human psychology, whatever it is, but it's a shame. It has to be okay to tell the truth.
Well, and I think the whole gamification that some management circles believe in, certain goals that are, I'm going to set something 25, 30, 50% above what, is even humanly possible. And not accept the fact that 12 people, that's how fast they can work. You got to go make some investments there with them if you're going to expect them to get better, or lo and behold, you have to add more people in order to move faster sometimes as well. So with that, we're at the top of the hour. Great conversation today. I really appreciate it. As always, this goes up to our, different repositories on SoundCloud, and we don't do YouTube anymore, but we do get up into iTunes and Google Play. Please make sure and share this around with people. Come in offline and vote up new questions throughout the week. And as always, you guys have a great rest of the next couple of weeks, and we'll be talking again soon.